Is it Molly or?
It's me. I'm recording.
Oh, hey,
Oh, you are
hey, Molly.
recording. Are you, Molly, are you also like letting people in the waiting room?
Yep, I will be in charge of that.
Yes, well, welcome everyone to Balkan Circle. My name's Mary Newberger. I'm a professor in the Department of History here at UT Austin. And I'm also the director of our program, the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. And Kirill is my co-host.
Thank you very much, Mary. It is Friday. It's the usual time for all things Balkan and, of course, Balkan Circle. My name is Kirill Avramov, and I'm an assistant professor at the Department of Slavic and Eurasian Studies at UT Austin. And I'm also a very proud co-host of you, Mary, as today we're continuing on the International Women's Day. Čestitao svima. We would like to congratulate all of the audience or the women in the audience and our colleagues. Today we do have something quite interesting as a discussion, a very interesting speaker, topics that I know people are keen on debating and learning a little bit more about in depth. So I'll be asking you to introduce our speaker today.
Okay, well, it is my pleasure today to introduce Vladimir Petrović. He has a PhD in comparative history of Central and Southeastern Europe from Central European University. He is also completing his postgraduate studies at NIOD Institute for War, Holocaust, and Genocide Studies in Amsterdam, where he currently works. And you can correct me if any of this is wrong. And he's worked at Institute for Contemporary History in Belgrade and also at Central European University. Petrović has worked in the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, which is really interesting, in the Serbian War Crimes Prosecutor's Office, and has published extensively on ethnic cleansing in the Balkans and attempts to undo its legacy, as well as on the history of the nonalignment movement during the Cold War. His latest book in English, and you have to correct me if there's any books after this one, is The Emergence of Historical Forensic Expertise, Clio Takes the Stand, which came out in 2017 with Routledge, which examines the role of historians and social scientists as expert witnesses in some of the most dramatic legal encounters of the 20th century. But I'm sure you have many more publications since then, so. All right, Vladimir, we're really excited to hear your talk today, so you can go ahead and get started.
Adam, I couldn't put it better myself. So Mary and Kirill, thank you so much for the invite, and I'm so thrilled to be a part of the Balkan Circle at this point, and I'm thrilled for several reasons that I will share with you in a moment. As you saw in the invite, the presentation itself will be dealing with contemporaneous issues and with certain hiccups which exist in Euro-Atlantic integration of the Balkan space and of Serbia in particular. I will be focusing on that country because I know it much better than the other countries in the region, because this was a country that I was born in, whose citizenship I have, aside of the US citizenship that I also hold, which is also why I had sent you, in addition to this presentation, I had sent you a brief paper on the developments in the US policies toward the Balkans pretty much since the late 80s until the early 2000s. The fact is that I was thinking a lot about this mini lecture, let's put it that way. And you know that the Balkans are in many ways a quagmire of ethnicities, of nations, dark conspiracies, and so on and so forth, and misperceptions as well. So the more I thought about it, the presentation just kept growing, and I was putting new elements in. Therefore, feel free to interrupt me at any point. Say, look, Lado, it had been quite enough. Let's switch to Q&A and let's discuss stuff that we are really interested in. So I'm absolutely open to derailing of this circle. I'm a historian, but I was also a war crimes investigator, and I'm basically very much vested actually in exploring connections between the Balkans and the US, because I got married in US and spending 10 years mostly teaching at Boston University, but also in Texas, where my in-laws are from. That's additional, how to say, semi-private reason that I'm thrilled to be a part of this circle. You can see that I'm quite a Fort Worth fan. Over the years, my kids have been growing and growing on these bulls in Fort Worth. And so, maintaining some sort of connections between the Serbia and the US is for me not only a matter of common sense, but also family peace. And I have to tell you, when I was teaching in Boston, especially if I would be teaching about the Balkans, it was always a problem that you must have encountered in your professional life. The students come and they really have not much practical knowledge. This is something that the student drew for me, let's say 5 or 6 years ago, a map of Europe, which is actually, if you can see, it's a fairly good map of Europe, Mediterranean region mostly, right? You see Italy over there, Spain, that's all okay. But the central bit of the map, and I will enlarge it for you, is really terra incognita. He just wrote to me like, no idea what is it which is between Greece and Romania and so on. And therefore, I'm teaching those students very many different things that are, of course, extremely well known to you, that the Balkans had been a region of a relatively troubled past and furthermore of uncertain future. The nation states which are formed in that region historically had quite some aspirations toward territories of other states. I show them very many maps. These are the maps of the overlapping territorial claims of different Balkan states through history. And these classes are entertaining, but I'm not sure that I actually succeeded to convey the essence of the problem, which is, of course, that the Balkans, as you see them today, of course, are still quite a mishmash of different ethnicities. This is the ethnic map of the Balkans. And in the central bit, you can see country which used to be called Yugoslavia, country that I was born in, the country which fell on my head and on heads of very many good people through sets of wars in which 130,000 got killed. However, the problem, in a sense, persevered. And the problem boils down to the question how to create a matrix in which certain amount of coexistence and predictability, if not harmonious relations, could be achieved both between the Balkan countries and with their neighbors and with the rest of the world. This is, of course, much more easier said than done. The most tangible project to do so, of course, was the idea of enlargement of the European Union. And indeed, successfully, as you all know, the European Union enlarged over time. The biggest one was the Eastern expansion, which you can see on the map to your left side, which included all the Baltic countries and basically all the Visegrad countries, plus Romania and Bulgaria came in on a quota, as I like to joke with my colleagues from Romania and Bulgaria a couple of years afterwards. And then Slovenia came in the first enlargement, and then Croatia was the last newcomer to the European Union, 12/13. The curious thing that appeared is that somehow, when a Balkan country enters EU, it stops being a Balkan country in a way. The expression Western Balkans, that many of you, of course, are certainly familiar with, is a curious one. One doesn't really know where Eastern Balkans are actually, and Western Balkans is a geopolitical term which is shrinking over time. Basically, that means Yugoslavia minus Slovenia plus Albania, and then now minus Croatia as well. The moment a certain country joins EU, it pops up and drops out of the Western Balkans. And so in some weird way, if this project is successful and all the Western Balkan countries somehow enter the EU, most probably that term itself is also going to disappear, probably will be changed with some more sterile terms such as Southeastern Europe. And I don't know what are we going to do in the circle, whether you're going to follow the same logic or not. Don't be concerned. This is not going to happen anytime soon, perhaps even never, actually. So the Balkans will remain the Balkans, because on the map, which is on your right, you will see the current situation. The blue denotes what European Union is, and the light blue what aspires to be the candidate countries. In this case, Serbia, Montenegro, Albania, Macedonia. Bosnia is, as of recent, also a candidate country, but it's not dark blue, which means that they are not part of the EU. Furthermore, the EU itself is going through a sort of a gradual reformation, with Great Britain stepping out of it, which is why it's red on this map. So it's quite volatile. If we zoom into the situation in the individual Balkan countries, we see that they are all in some sort of transaction with the European Union, which is why this lecture is grounded in this idea of stabilocracy and stabilization between the Balkans, EU, and Serbia. This is somewhat obsolete. As I mentioned, Bosnia is a candidate as well now. Probably not all of you are experts in the negotiation procedures. It sounds mighty fine to say that you're a candidate country for the EU, but Turkey had been a candidate country literally for decades without any meaningful progress, and actually with a lot of regress in the last 10 or 15 years. So it sounds flashy, but it means nothing. There are plenty of technicalities in the process of European accession. It boils down to enough. Oh, Professor Kulikov, hello, pleasure to see you again. And in a sense, there are many chapters which are devoted to very particular technocratic things such as ecology. Some of those are extremely important, such as the rule of law and so on. And again, it sounds mighty fine to say that, let's say, Montenegro has 32 open chapters, but the trick is to have them closed at some point, and that can last for decades. So it's a bit of a tricky process. If we zoom into Serbia now very shortly, we would again see that on paper, Serbia stands relatively well. It's a candidate country. It had signed the so-called Stabilization and Association Treaty in 2013. It negotiates. There are mutual conferences. Some chapters are open. Some are even provisionally closed. So if we were to treat this as a historical source, we would be saying, fine, okay, so things are happening and so on. My younger colleagues, my former students, are actually all engaged in different types of promotion of European path of Serbia, NGOs and GOs and GONGOs, and they are making all of these lovely infographics about the path, the European, so-called European path of Serbia. We can talk more about it. I love to to highlight their work, but the thing is that they are also monitoring something which is more ominous. The news which is coming from Serbia as it is related to European Union is showing something else. It's showing exasperation, if not resentment, from both negotiating sides. These are just relatively random news. Serbia's slim chances to progress, Serbia opening up to Russia, anti-corruption strategy in Serbia not working, report on stalling of the process of negotiation, and so on. So if you put your ear on the ground, actually you don't really hear any upbeats in that regard. That doesn't stop the panache of intragovernmental meetings. They're happening all the time. From the Thessaloniki meeting that somebody might remember in 2003-ish or so. In 2003, in Thessaloniki, European Union absolutely offered European future to all the Western Balkan countries. And the only dilemma back then, for those of us who remember those bygones, was whether at a certain point all the Balkan countries should be simply swallowed by the EU, or should it be something like a competition between them, like a regatta, so that those who kind of fulfilled the criteria faster would get in faster, and so on. But that was kind of the only dilemma in town. From 2024, that looks completely like a science fiction, for the reasons that I will come to in a moment. Again, European leadership keeps coming to the Balkans. The Balkan leaders are meeting one another. There are so many summits, beautiful pictures of European and local dignitaries and different folkish performances for them and all these things. But if you look in the documents, you see something else. This is the current state of affairs in Serbia. Basically, the last milestone on this paper, on this slide, is from December 2021. Pedestrian, boring stuff, how many chapters are open. And if you go down the line, you will see the same thing. You will see that the methodology of accession is being constantly revised, and you will actually see that the progress doesn't really exist. So why am I mentioning Serbia all the time? One of the reasons is also that Euro enthusiasm in Serbia is in serious decline. That was the case, well, for quite some time. But you know that as almost as a rule, Euro enthusiasm was always quite high in countries which were supposed to be accessing it. It's a relatively rare case that you have a Eurosceptical country to begin with, which is sort of negotiating, but Serbia is definitely one such. Even under the best circumstances, and if the question is really flattering, like, are you in favor of your country joining the European Union? I mean, this is a question that, I mean, I don't know, any country would probably say yes, no matter how far. Well, the Serbs are, 1/3 would be kind of like a solid no. Even those who would say yes would probably say yes, but under certain conditions, and so on and so forth. And that is really interesting. There are really some important and telling misperceptions in the Serbian public, which are seen repeatedly through the surveys. If you ask the Serbs about the aid and about investments, almost without mistake, you will get the same cognitive dissonance. The Serbs stubbornly believe that China and even Russia are the biggest aid givers, donors to Serbia, and also that China and Russia are the biggest investors in Serbia. And this is just not the case, factually. Here you see two infographics. One is on aid, another one is on the investments. You will see that the EU by far is the biggest, firstly, aid giver to Serbia, secondly, investor in Serbia, and also export-import partner of Serbia. America is actually also quite high there, whereas Russia and China are almost a statistical mistake on both accounts. But again, in politics, probably perceptions are even more important than reality when it comes to these matters. And that leads to a very, very interesting question. Why? Why is that the case? Why is that happening? Why is Serbia such an outlier in that case? I'm on a project with an institute from Norway, which is supposed to do exactly that. The project is called Re-engage, and it's going to try to look anew at the European neighborhood policy and to see how will Europe reposition itself towards 6 countries which are in its antechambers. And that's Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, from the northern package, so to say, and then Albania, Bosnia, and Serbia from the Southeast European package. So in 3 or 4 years, I'll come back to you with much more solid data on why Serbia is positioning itself the way it positions. But my preliminary hunch, and actually my hunch for this talk tonight, will be that the key is not really so much in the hands of European Union and in perceptions of Europe, but of something else, which is the Serbian relations with NATO. And Serbian relations with NATO had been extremely problematic since at least since 1999, probably even before in a sense. And that is actually what explains also Euroscepticism. If you quiz people in the Western Balkans about how they perceive NATO, you would again see that Serbia is quite an outlier, with really, really slim majority having any sort of positive sentiment about NATO. Like around 10% of the population thinks neutrally or positively about NATO. 90% is sort of negatively disposed. Even worse, that doesn't change over time. It's very stable. Even after the Russian invasion to Ukraine, that had remained relatively stable. Again, even worse, if you look at some of the neighbors, you see the complete reverse. So in Kosovo, Euro-Atlantic enthusiasm is at a historic high. And this is, of course, very telling. We can also talk about how and why that is the case. If we go into these sentiments with a bit more detail, I took only one out of many surveys. We would see that basically in Serbia, nobody supports NATO membership. Some slim support there is for some sort of technical cooperation between Serbia and NATO. But actually, the most interesting thing is that people, by and large, have no idea that NATO and EU are incredibly connected. So people are, when you ask them, they are not able to understand that majority of EU countries, or at least those who matter the most, are functioning members, active members of the NATO alliance. And furthermore, European Union is also trying to maintain that idea of duality because they understand, okay, fine, the Serbs don't like NATO, so let us pretend that we are just negotiating with the European Union and somehow wing it so that the NATO thing remains somewhere in the background. I know that sounds a bit naive, but it's also from my conversation with one former U.S. ambassador. I mean, that's they thought that this could be the way to go and unlock the dark Serbian heart. And I asked him then, so what do you think? Why is this heart so dark when it comes to NATO? Where does this lack of enthusiasm come from? And of course, that had led us to the NATO bombing of Federal Republic of Yugoslavia in 1999. So that was an air raid campaign, which lasted from March to June 1999. We talked about it a bit actually before the circle even started. It's an absolute bone of contention for several reasons. You might remember why it started. I mean, it started also because security situation in Kosovo was deteriorating and Serbian armed forces and police were becoming ever more systematic in trying to crash the Kosovo Liberation Army. And also they were tapping into their base, into the villages which were protecting the Kosovo Liberation Army. And at some point, the Americans thought that preemptive humanitarian intervention would be the way to go. The problem was that it was conducted without the Security Council authorization. And now we know, back then we didn't know, but now we know that it had opened up quite a dangerous precedent. So after Iraq, after Afghanistan, and of course now after Ukraine, we see that actually certain gates of lawlessness indeed did open then for reasons which are, I mean, I don't know, it's difficult to say now what was behind the reasoning of Albright and of Clinton administration back then. In the paper I circulated to you, that paper actually deals with evolution of American policy toward Yugoslavia in the 90s. And it shows that the Americans didn't really give much serious thought anyhow to Balkan matters. And I absolutely understand that. If it's 1990 or 1991 and the USSR is dissolving, and you have to worry about the nuclear warheads, on the top of it, you have a war in the Gulf and the oil and potential clogging in Suez and God knows what, probably one is really not too inclined to think about those matters. By the end of the 1990s, it seems to me that this implicit idea of the end of history was riding so high that people were completely blinded with this idea that they are really creating a new liberal political order, and they were mopping up last points of resistance, Serbia being actually one of those. What happened in practice was that the country was bombed. In the end, indeed, Serbian offensive on Kosovo was stalled, and Serbia withdrew its police and the military from Kosovo, and NATO came in. But the price was huge, and the price in human toll, it was about somewhat less than 1,000 persons. Serbian statistics are, of course, much much richer and colorful, but they are not correct. We know almost into a person, courtesy of Humanitarian Law Center, extremely brave NGO from Belgrade, that about 750 people died. Roughly more than half of them were civilians. Paradoxically, more Albanian civilians died in bombing than Serbian civilians. I will explain perhaps in Q&A how did that happen. But again, just like with these public opinion surveys, sometimes perceptions are more important than reality. In this case, the perception widely shared in Serbia was that bombing was not only unlawful, but it was also unethical. That opinion is not shared widely in the West, and nobody likes to talk about it. So this is one of those things that people don't really talk about because they would prefer to forget. The problem is that the things that you tend to not address, if you don't address them critically and timely by people who are well-minded and they want to do something good about it, then you leave it to others who are not necessarily benevolent about it. There had been several bombings which had been exceptionally cruel. For instance, Serbian TV was bombed at some point, and I will dwell on it only shortly because I think it's a good example which shows this layers of complexity. At some point during the bombing, NATO decided that the television is such a vehicle of Milosevic's propaganda, which it was, by the way. When I was working in the prosecution, one of the cases we had was against editors and journalists, and it was a case for inciting to commit war crimes. Fine. So NATO says TV is actually a weapon of war. And then NATO calls Serbian TV or Serbian military and tells them, look, we are going to bomb you tonight. Just to tell you, you can evacuate, which then it means it becomes some sort of a theater, right? So they call, they say evacuate people. They were expecting that the Serbs will evacuate the journalists. Unfortunately, the Serbs evacuated only the top journalists. So people who remained in the building were technicians and auxiliary staff. And more than a dozen of them, like 20 of them, was killed, and many others were wounded in a strike. After the war and after the bombing, the head of the TV was also prosecuted for negligence, for making them intentionally stay. He wanted them there so that somebody dies, and so then the dirt goes to NATO. And so what I mean to say is that the victims are pissed with everybody. They're pissed with Milosevic, they're pissed with the director who left them to live there, but ultimately they're pissed with Americans for bombing them in the first place. On the right side, you see the monument called Why or Zašto in Serbian with the names of these people in front of the TV building. And once, if you come to Belgrade, by the way, let me know if you intend to come to Belgrade. If I'm not physically there, I would be happy to facilitate your visit. You will see that discrete monument. And now how culture of memory actually works in really hidden and mysterious ways. This why or zašto thing, it's not the first time it appears in Serbian collective martyrdom, because the Serbs are almost champions in wrapping their national history in a sequence of mournings about lost this and about lost that and about being betrayed by this ally and about being betrayed by that ally. So Belgrade was also heavily bombed by the Allies in 43 and especially in 44, like many other European cities. But the Serbs really took it, like for instance, the Dutch took it very lightly, even though Rotterdam was heavily, heavily bombarded. The Serbs tended to take this bombing of Belgrade in 44, which had plenty of civilian victims, very hard. And still, you can see and find people saying that the Allies killed much more people than the Axis. Hitler bombed Belgrade viciously in 41, but this bombing was even more vicious. And this is the propaganda back then of the Serbian collaborationist government with the same word, like why, like zašto. So just like a, let's say, commonsensical question, like why killing kids or innocent people and so on. So I'm trying to depict the amount of pent-up anguish which appears. And again, I will mention Ukraine for another reason. Volodymyr knows that I'm in constant touch with plenty of Ukrainian students through an initiative called Invisible University for Ukraine. Unmistakably, I see how much pent-up anger appears if you are under bombs. There is something very atypical about it, and the atypical thing is that you can't do anything about it. You can just wait, and you have zero control or even illusion of control, and so on. And so this is really a specific psychological situation, which means that with bombing you can do many things. You can do this thing that Time magazine here mentioned. You can bring Serbs to heel eventually, probably, but the thing is, at what psychological cost? Which kind of future potential partners or allies would you actually expect to have that way? Even during the bombing, if I can now go into the personal memories of 1999, I was shocked how sterile the US propaganda was, or NATO propaganda, if you wish. Basically, some leaflets which were supposed to be threatening were just spread throughout Belgrade, throughout Serbia, throughout Kosovo, which were trying to scare off people, but actually people were laughing them away. And Serbian counter propaganda was much more effective. Like, for instance, at some point, one plane was downed, which is supposed to be invisible. And people were, of course, delighted by downing that F-117. And the punchline was, sorry, guys, we didn't know it was invisible. So that's why we shot it. But the thing is, it was so sterile, and I saw such lack of imagination. It was clearly not the war for minds and hearts or something like that. NATO had even completely functioning TV in Bosnia, in Tuzla, and I could see it from Belgrade, and I was watching it. And I was horrified to see that all day long, night and day, on that frequency, you would have stupid leaflets like this one showed front side, back side, front side, back side, or something written in some Serbian which I could even barely understand, or which looked like Croatian, or it was simply unintelligible. And I was thinking, my God, the lonely superpower with so many psychological operations and this and that, is this really the best one can come up with, right? What's with all these things of like putting LSD in in the water tanks or whatever, or influencing people through some special vibes and whatnot? Nothing like First World War type of a standard. The consequence of that was that Milosevic was indeed hurt by that bombing, but he didn't fall from power then. He fell from power a year after through a sort of a popular uprising which kicked him out, and Serbia was basically reintegrated into the world system. And that the situation got interesting actually only then. With Milosevic out, there were two figures, Zoran Đinđić and Vojislav Koštunica. Đinđić was more, how to put it, pro-reformist oriented and European oriented and all that, much more ready to deal with Milosevic's legacy. Koštunica more cautious, more inward looking, more nationalistic, and happier to integrate the remnants of the Milosevic system. So that was the scene. But still, nobody was talking about the war. It was too fresh, and it was clear that deposal of Milosevic, in order to be stabilized, the idea was to stabilize things. This is why leitmotif of this mini lecture is how you slide from stabilization into stabilocracy. Because it's very difficult to stabilize country after such transition. Take the case of Đinđić, who was indeed a sort of a hope of Serbia at that moment. Đinđić was pressurized heavily when Milosevic came from power to extradite him to the Hague Tribunal, which he did. It was an extremely bold move. This is him, by the way, on the left, in a press conference where he completely unconstitutionally, actually, literally which is understandable because constitution was, by the way, written by Milosevic. He dumped Milosevic into the Hague. This grainy image here is Milosevic being taken from a police chopper into the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, in which he died. Very bold move, especially if you think of some other countries. Heads of the states operate with such impunity. I will take the US, for example, my other chosen homeland, take my line. How far do you actually go up the chain of command when you prosecute those things? Not really, not far. Take the actual presidential candidates and hopefuls. I mean, they seem to be fighting between the jail and the Oval Office, right? And if they get the Oval Office, they will also get impunity. So as a reward, in a sense, Djindjic got a bullet through his back, and he was killed in April 2003 by the different paramilitaries and Milosevic loyalists. I'm not going to go into the details now, but now in retrospect, I can be just remorseful that he wasn't given much bigger international support in that very difficult transitional period. If he had back then 10% of international support that current Serbian government enjoys, he would have probably been alive, and we would be talking about some other much happier topic. With him out of the picture, the other guy came to the fore, the more nationalistic guy called Vojislav Koštunica, and the issue of Kosovo came about. If you remember, and you know, of course, you know all that, Serbia doesn't recognize Kosovo and technically considers it a part of its own territory. The US and most of European countries acknowledged Kosovo's independence in 2008. That Koštunica guy created huge demonstrations in Belgrade. And then when those demonstrations in 2008, they went out of hand. And when they went out of hand, there was a lot of looting in the city, but more dangerously, the demonstrators went to the US embassy and firstly got into the embassy. That's the visual you can see in the upper right corner. And then they set it on fire, which is the visual that you can see at the bottom. Now, I was there. I mean, I wasn't at the embassy. I would have been if I knew what was going to happen. But what I saw was something really strange. I remember the minister, so-called minister for Kosovo. I met him on the street. I knew him because he's an academic and so on. He was literally guiding the kids, those hooligans, down the street. I didn't know where is he guiding them. After the fact, I understood that he's guiding them in the direction of the U.S. embassy. U.S. embassy was evacuated anyhow. The Marines were not in their usual outpost, so the only casualty was one of the protesters who I think he collapsed because of the smoke, and then he was burned to death in that incident. But I mean, you know how it is. Even when somebody burns an American flag, that leaves quite a scar in bilateral relations. And furthermore, burning an embassy is something that is very difficult to somehow straighten afterwards. To me, it was also interesting that the Americans took it like champs. They didn't really mention that. So just like the Serbs are not really mentioning that 1999 all that much, the Americans were, oh, okay, we'll build another embassy. And indeed, they built even bigger embassy with a lot of concrete and the usual stuff. It's barely accessible now. It's right next to the former king's castle. So it seemed on the surface as if no harm was done. Below the surface, a lot of harm was done, because there was a complete other strategy which was implemented, I think, by the US and also by the EU. It seems to me that at some point an agreement was reached that Serbia is really not able to reform democratically. That all those powers, be them Djindjic, be them Koštunica, and so on, are not really able to steer the wheel anyhow, and that they should be fostered into rehabilitating the previous ancien regime people. And so basically what had happened was that the number of figures from the Milosevic apparatus got a second wind. They got a second life. Take this guy, for example. His name is Ivica Dačić. He is the current president of Milosevic's party. When Milosevic died in jail in 2006, that guy, Ivica Dačić, was brokenhearted. Here you see him at Milosevic's funeral on the left. See, devastated, very, very sad. A couple of years afterwards, sharing the Socialist Party of Serbia, he signed an agreement with the Democratic Party about basically burying the hatchets and starting anew. So that was in 2008. And therefore, entire Milosevic's infrastructure kind of reformed and took part in the government. I think that was a clear signal. Plus, nobody had anything against that. And all of a sudden, former Milosevic crony became bestie with commissioners of the European Union, with the NATO dignitaries. Nobody says a thing, even though he had quite a lot of, we would say in Serbia, putera na glavi, butter on his head, politically speaking, but also organized crime speaking. No wonder he became Minister of Interior, because, I mean, if you have organized crime connections, it's very good if you are also a Minister of the Interior. So that was one nail in the coffin of Serbians' transformation. The other nail, even a bigger one, was that in the meanwhile, even more malignant factors in Serbian politics emerged, the so-called Radical Party. Those are people who were sometimes aligned with Milosevic, but basically they were even more radical than him. And they played the role that Zhirinovsky was playing in Russia for a long while to Yeltsin. But they were always at the cusp of getting a hold on power in Serbia. And so when Milosevic died, they were also very sad. They also took part in the same procession that you can see here, that little the previous ones were, and so on. And they were considered to be a poo-poo entity, like everybody pretended they are not there. They get 40% of electoral power, but everybody else just creates coalition without them, and that was it. That was how politics was ran in Serbia between 2005-ish and 2010-ish or so. It sounds kind of dumb, but you see, now I'm living in the Netherlands, my third chosen homeland, and I see that they are about to do the same thing. So here also a populist and extremely unsavory character got about 30% of the electorate, and the idea is to try to ignore it, and so on. So, okay, at a certain point, there was a turnover. The Radical Party was renamed into a Progressive Party, exactly the same leadership, except for the top leader called Vojislav Šešelj, because he was really too difficult to reintegrate. He was in jail in The Hague back then. But again, the same people, see this mourner here, the mourner from the Radical Party to your right, becomes president of Serbia in 2012. Fair elections, that's true, but this is not so important for this story. The important thing for the story was that he was immediately integrated in the European elite, in a sense. And again, you see this loving look that he gives to Hillary Clinton on the photo on the upper right corner, also to Ashton. She was the European, basically, in effect, Minister for Foreign Affairs, to Juncker, to Tusk, and so on. As if omerta was made, that they will never speak about the past, because these people are easy targets. That guy Nikolic, I wouldn't say he, killed somebody personally, even though there was a proto case in my prosecution against him. But I would say he is definitely one handshake away from direct killers. That I can say with full authority of a forensic expert. If you think that can't get worse, it can actually get worse, because when Nikolic finished his presidency, much younger dude came and succeeded him. This is the current president of Serbia, called Aleksandar Vučić. He was a prime minister during Nikolic's presidency, and he is a president from 2017, and I have no idea when will he stop. I think he's going to head for quite a while. That creates a very strange situation. He is, on the one hand, now a champion of European values. Here you see him promising that we will never stop on our European path and all these things. That's the rhetorics. In reality, Serbia is nosediving from the moment he took the reins of power in all the possible aspects of human rights, rule of law, basic provisions, media liberties, and so on. And so Serbia is now, at best, some sort of compromised democracy. It was never really stellar when it comes to these things, but at least it showed some potentials. At this moment, it's more like a partocracy, whereby the Progressive Party is indeed a clique which controls pretty much everything which is important, and he controls everything which is important in that party. Urbanization, in a sense, or democratic backsliding, hit it very hard. Again, he is also one of the people, you see him here as a mourner. He has a lot of salt on his tail. For instance, I will just give you an example. During Srebrenica, he was an MP in the Serbian parliament, a very young guy then, in 1995, and he held a speech in which he said, Okay, well, I mean, if the Muslims continue shooting, we will definitely just kill 100 Muslims for every killed Serb. So they are really having a lot of salt on their tail, but nobody is really trying to catch them for that tail. All on the contrary, just like Nikolic before him, just like Dacic before him, he's wined and dined whenever he appears in the European circles, and he is in effect abolished, which is even stranger because he always maintained excellent relations with Russia. So this is one of the cartoons from the time. Because you can imagine, if I can make a small pause, and again, if I'm overstepping the time, I'm sorry, I get a bit emotional when it comes to these topics. If I overstep the time, Volodymyr, please just tell me stop. You can imagine how these developments basically cut down the entire Serbian, how to put it, progressive intelligentsia. So all these people who were hoping to topple Milosevic and to, for whichever reason, transform Serbia for the better, found themselves cut out from all the support because all of a sudden there was this tide of democratic backsliding and the progressives taking the power. And then you look to the West as kind of like instinctive natural ally in these things, and you see that the West is patting Vucic on the back and even giving you subtle signals, don't rock the boat, you will come to the EU eventually, and so on and so forth. And so many people were simply, they said, well, I don't know, like I just don't buy it. I'm not buying what you're selling. And they went into a very, very passive position, hating at the same time Vucic, progressives, Milosevic, Putin, and the West. And here you see basically one of the cartoons which is saying, yes, fine, Vucic will come into the European Union, but he has to drag this enormous baggage of medals he's given by Putin. Now, that creates complete dichotomy, which you can see in Belgrade whenever you go. The government is talking EU lingo and jargons. They became very good at it. They are very quick with computers and so on. So there is certain algorithmization of politics which has happened. But if you go in the streets and if you look left and right, you see that really there is some sort of a grassroots anti-Westernism, which evolved as a constant reflex against something. At this point, it's really difficult to say what is the public opinion because it's being ever more squeezed. We don't really have, I mean, on paper, we have all the media liberties. We just don't have those media, which can cover entire country through national frequency. So it's tough to say what people are thinking. There are many murals of Putin. This is the most famous one. I like it because it appears and disappears almost on weekly level. Like there are activists for peace or pro-Ukrainians and like that, and then they destroy it, and then it's redone, and then somebody takes his eyes out, and then a pirate thing goes, and it's very interesting. I hope that Serbian Secret Service, well, knowing Serbian Secret Service, they probably monitor that place heavily. I wish that they would give it to me one day, like only footages from that corner where Putin's thing is. It would be splendid anthropology and so on. You also have these things like never into NATO, never into European Union. And actually, on the far right, people are much more intelligent than we care to think. They do know that European Union, that basically Euro integrations cannot be divorced from Euro-Atlantic integrations. They know that in reality, it's almost a package deal. And so they say no to EU as well as to NATO. And on the fringe, you have all those propaganda, which is spread through the internet and through smaller communities which are extremely radicalized, and this is how they perceive NATO as baby killers who should be stopped immediately, let alone talked with. Now, this, of course, I was kind of keeping it a bit amusing, but it's actually not amusing at all because Vucic's regime is very dangerous. I will show you a small clip of how he deals with dissent when dissent becomes dangerous. This was from 2021. Let's see actually if it will work. There were demonstrations in Belgrade after he introduced the curfew during Corona times. He introduced a very drastic curfew overnight. Just a second to put the sound. You should at least hear the sound of the guy. I will translate what he has to say.
Svako javno okupljanje sa više od 5 ljudi bilo u zatvorenom, bilo u otvorenom prostoru.
More than 5 people meet
A od petka
forbidden.
Idemo
from Friday we go to complete
Na dugački
lockdown,
policijski sat, odnosno zabranu kretanja.
forbidden
Zaključno sa
movement.
ponedeljkom, a onda od ponedeljka ćemo da vidimo dalje.
And then a complete, how we say in Slovenia, a complete ritual happens. Oops, sorry. I think I did something wrong, but I don't know what. And then by the end of the night, the cavalry appeared out of nowhere. I didn't even know that our police has cavalry, and the cavalry literally cleansed the demonstrators from the street. But what puzzled me a lot was that the media presentation of these protests in the West was extremely biased in a pro-Vučić way. Basically, the media was saying more or less crazy Serbs are protesting against the corona measures. You know how it was in the beginning, like all the liberals were for enormous measures, all the conservatives was for happy-go-lucky. And so, no, but it wasn't about that. It was just a trigger, let's say. The main reason was protesting against the regime, which is brutal and which is oppressive. I mean, in such situations, nobody cares about corona. Hey, when I was in Ukraine in May 2022, the war is the best cure for corona in a sense, but just nobody cares about it. So, but the West was shielding still, in a sense, Vučić by taking the clout out of the protesters in this bizarre way. And I mean, I'm the last person to be a conspiracy theorist, but I just found it bizarre that he would get a helping hand. And I kept thinking, okay, what does he do for Uncle Sam or for anybody? So that one thing is not to attack somebody openly, but to help somebody, well, clearly you need to do something for. Well, he did a couple of things, especially for the Trump administration. So Serbia and Kosovo have issues which are unresolved. And at some point, Trump wanted to be like to have some sort of foreign political success, and that was like really a moment of transfer of shame for me when I watched the Vučić in Oval Office or wherever the hell this is. I mean, Trump really has a thing of humiliating people. He's standing like some bad pupil in the school on a chair in front of Trump. And then Trump made the Kosovo prime minister and Vučić, no, Kosovo president then, and Vučić to sign some treaties, putting them on these small tables next to him. Crazy stuff. And he even put in a treaty that Serbia and Kosovo are also supposed to move their embassies to Jerusalem, which is something that Vučić was absolutely not cognizant of. So he was just looking at the text and he was like, hey, who so crazy stuff. And you would think, okay, that was a crazy mandate and it's done now and so on, but it's not the case. I was in Serbia for a long while last year. There was an event which is a sort of a black swan. In one of the Serbian elementary schools, a very young kid shot plenty of his friends. I know that this is unfortunately nothing new, that the US is already normalizing it, or people are desensitized and so on. But this was our first time, and people were just shocked because everybody was a minor there, and he was a minor. He is a minor, and we are just not accustomed to that. We are accustomed to a lot of violence, but ultimately our mental justification, even when we do horrible things, is that we do it for our kids. And so seeing that the kids are growing into mass killers was really something that terrified everybody, including Vučić, I think, at the early stage. So there were huge protests throughout last year, really huge. I'm really talking hundreds of thousands of people. And an old experienced American diplomat, Christopher Hill, became an ambassador. And I thought, aha, finally it's happening. So now something's going to be cooked up. And nothing was cooked up. So he, again, tacitly, I wouldn't say supported Vučić, but definitely nothing of a kind which was addressed against Milosevic in the 90s was happening. It was clear that Vučić is still important for something. My hunch is that this was also not only because of Kosovo, where Vučić is negotiating something, he is sitting at the table, but also that with beginning when the war in Ukraine turned into this new stage, the US was harboring certain interests, and the US was trying to reverse Serbia's position vis-a-vis Russia, which on paper it succeeded because Serbia votes pretty loyally votes against Russia in the United Nations, notwithstanding otherwise it's pro-Russian rhetorics and whatnot. On paper, it's basically an ally of Ukraine. It even sells weaponry to Ukraine, even though it's widely perceived as a Russian satellite in the Balkans. So there is this clear antinomy. Now, why is this, I think, very short-sighted? Because Vučić has many friends, and you see, he is really on relatively good terms in general with Putin and also with the Chinese. He inherited some of these Tito's ideas of non-alignment, but even for Tito, sometimes it was extremely challenging to play West against East and North against South. Vučić doesn't really have neither that type of charisma nor resources of that country. And that is what makes his position very unstable. And that is what makes Serbia extremely unstable because it's a strong regime, but basically the institutions are extremely weak. So therefore, there is no way of saying how this regime is going to develop. That also matters because Serbia is still a key country in the Balkans, partially because it's the biggest among those candidate countries, but partially because everything which happens in Serbia resonates to Bosnia immediately, simply because of the composition of Bosnia after the 1995 Dayton Agreement, and it resonates into Montenegro because of the sizable number of Montenegrins who feel themselves as Serbs, and it resonates on Kosovo because simply those two countries don't recognize each other. And so this is a problem which is sort of not really solved. European Union is now announcing its new neighborhood policy that, again, I will be keenly looking on in the next couple of years. But it's not really promising because nothing is clear. There are these photos which are always there on the internet when somebody gets something. Like, for instance, when Georgia got the candidacy, I mean, Bosnia was waiting for that candidacy for 10 years or something, and they barely got it last year and so on. And there is this feeling of being left behind. And also, I mean, Ukraine was, of course, speed-tracked for understandable and absolutely justifiable reasons. But then there are Macedonians there sitting and saying, come on, guys, we had been doing everything you told us to do. We even changed the name of the country to appease the Greeks. I don't know what else do you want us to do in order to get us there. So it seems to me that Europe is growingly losing its soft power, and that the Balkan people feel that they are coming to the party, not at 10 o'clock when everything is starting, but it's kind of like 4 p.m., 4 a.m. in the morning. The best wine is drunk, everybody is out, and there are like cigarette butts in the ashtray. And the joke was, it was a joke back then, and now it becomes reality that the moment all the Balkan countries get integrated in the EU will just formally disintegrate, actually. I don't know if that will happen, but what I do know is that the Balkans remain a proverbial powder keg. Again, I'm not at all like self-orientalizing or anything. I think in this conversation it came clear that there are external and internal reasons why they are powder keg, whereby some of the countries are in NATO, like Montenegro, like Albania. The other ones are pretending that they negotiate with the EU, like Serbia. Kosovo would so much like to be in NATO, but it's not invited there, and so on and so forth. So basically, if second front should be open somewhere logically in Europe, that could easily be done in the Balkans. And it almost happened in September 2023. There was a huge incident in a monastery called Banjska, where a number of Serbian paramilitaries were caught with their pants down, basically, and some of them were killed. The troublesome thing was that nobody knew who had sent them there. Vučić has a very strong grip on Serbia, but it's widely believed that it wasn't him. He was on a state visit somewhere. Is it possible? It's conceivable that Russians have enough influence in the government to just do it under his nose, actually, and so on. So this is why this situation is actually much more precarious. And a cynic could say that the only reason there is no more instability in the Western Balkans is that our best able-bodied men are busy driving trucks in Germany and in Switzerland, or are bouncers in the discotheques in the West. We demilitarized, meaning that most countries have no general military conscription, and therefore there is a huge exodus of people from the Balkans. And so those who should be waging wars and serving in the hospitals and so on are busy in the Western hospitals, which probably is good from the point of view of war, but it's very bad from the point of view of human resources, which are dwindling in an otherwise very problematic field. I'm not going to bore you about the annual progress reviews, but again, they are sterile and they are not reflecting the urgency of the situation. The main problem to my mind is that at this point, nobody can say how will this map look like in 5 years. Not in terms of the Western Balkans, not in terms of Eastern Europe, not even in terms of the EU. And your hunch is as good as mine, so probably it's high time I stop talking and pass the floor to you on this topic, or actually any other topic.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was fantastic. Thank you. That was riveting.
I'm so sorry I stepped over the
Oh,
allocated
no, it's
time.
okay. I wasn't going to stop
Was in
you
the
because
heat of the moment.
it was all kind of really interesting. Well, so I guess people can be gathering their thoughts on questions. If anyone has a question, feel free to raise their hand. I have a ton of questions. I'm not sure where to start actually, but let me kind of formulate my question here. I think I really am fascinated, and I found your kind of analysis of the longer term Western policy in the Balkans to be right, spot on about our own sort of inconsistency and kind of problematic precedents that were set and things like that. At the same time, it's like, I guess I always, when I'm teaching my students about this too and talking to my students about it, I always kind of say basically the US is damned if it does and damned if it doesn't. So we're always kind of in a situation where, like, if we don't intervene, it looks bad. If we do intervene, it looks bad. Now, I think in intervening, we didn't necessarily have to bomb Belgrade. I mean, like, the kind of intervention is also important. And I totally agree that when that happened, I was completely, at the time, shocked and couldn't believe it was happening. So I think it was really kind of problematic. But even since then, I'm really interested to see how this progression of, like, how they're dealing with various politicians since then and the politics, and sort of like what is the kind of, I guess, better sort of track to follow. What would you have them do? Because we have been cooperating with dictators for as long as our history, essentially. And in the Cold War, of course, right-wing dictators were perfectly fine with us. We were cooperating with them right and left, even installing them in power. I'm not saying it's a good thing. I'm not saying we're consistent in our values, like in the West, broader West. And of course, the West is divided in its approach to all these things. We're internally divided in our own country and our approach to all these things. But as far as, like, dealing with the rise of the right now in Eastern Europe, I guess, sort of like what would be kind of a better approach? What would be a better tactic? So that's one. And then the other thing I actually wanted to ask in relation to this kind of post-Yugoslav wars trajectory, because this is an area of expertise for yours, is can you talk a little bit about the result of the War Crimes Tribunal on kind of Serbian perceptions of the West? Because I know, like, they wanted Clinton to be brought up on war crimes for the bombing of Belgrade, which of course was
Yes.
thrown out. But
Yes,
this
yes.
idea of a sort of selective justice in which the Serbs were
Yes.
punished more than anyone else.
Yes. So, unfortunately, there is no short answer. I will try to provide one nonetheless. What went wrong? It's very difficult to say. It's not even a backsliding anymore in Eastern or Southeastern Europe. It's anywhere. I think all eyes now are on Germany and June. If Alternative for Deutschland gets over 30%, that will mean that this Netherlands scenario of 30% for extreme right is not an outlier, and that's something you have to live with. And then all eyes are on November and the US, and so unfortunately, the Yugoslavs, I know those Yugoslavs who now they have this Schadenfreude thing, because you remember the 90s as well as I. It seemed that Yugos and Rwandians and I don't know, Sierra Leoneans are just like some crazy tribal guys who are doing something incomprehensible to normal people. European Union was coming about, everything seemed peachy. Even Russia was in partnership for peace and whatnot, right? And we were just kind of like bandwagoning, jumped out of history. That was the idea. That was our idea as well. My idea. I was like, come on, get your stuff together and like, is it possible, right? And now I see again, but the knowledge comes mostly when it's useless, actually, that that was more like a sort of an indicator of things to come in some way. So it wasn't remnant of the 20th century, as we all thought, the last stroke, but something much, much more ominous. And that makes some people, again, in the Balkans, like I told you so, or whatever kind of, but me not at all, because, well, when there is a problem in the Balkans, you can escape, for instance, you can go to the US. But when there's a problem in the US, then all the dominoes are falling down. And so I always think that the problem should be somehow managed in the core. However, it's sometimes difficult to say where the core is. Take Ukraine, for example. So we can help as much as we can, and we should, to Ukrainians. Uh, but if the problem would be solved in Russia somehow, then most probably the Ukrainian problem would be solved on its own. And we wouldn't have to run to Ossetia to see what's happening to the other problems and so on. In that way, I think at this point, America should solve its own problem very quickly, because otherwise it's not going to be able to solve anything in the long time to come. That's my first thing. Uh, Even in the late 90s, I think what happened was an imperial overreach. And Paul Kennedy and the others did write about it already, the rise and the fall of great powers and something like that. Hubris, enormous hubris. In this paper, and that's why I sent it to you, I'm sort of fishing for comments as well, because now I'm a Serb as well as American, actually. I spent quite a lot of time in the US. And looking at it from that vantage point, I see this enormous temptation of doing the right thing. And sometimes you don't even know if it's hypocritical or not. It's very difficult to say. Sometimes it's really the genuine temptation of doing something, or understanding, which you mentioned, that not doing something actually means being a accomplice to genocide. Because, for instance, Serbia cannot do anything about Somalia or about Rwanda, right? But America can do everything about it if it wants. If it doesn't want, it's kind of liable for not doing something. So I understand. I commiserate, if you wish. But then the problem is, and it's very depressing, that the East is very brutal and the West is rather hypocritical. And then, and then we all have to make choices. That's the situation which people in the Balkans feel in their bones. They really know that East is brutal and West is hypocritical, but they probably think, okay, so if this is the case, uh, whom should we side with? It's not an irrational dilemma. It's actually a relatively rational dilemma. Because if you side with the wrong ones and you are cast aside at some point, and the US unfortunately has a long tradition of ditching its allies, take Afghanistan, for example, you don't want to end up in that situation. So that's many things are much less foolish than they seem. About the ICTY, I really hope I will come to Austin in summertime, and we can, if you wish, I apply to redo this, because this is the topic I know too well. The key problem is similar. ICTY emerged in 1990s during this Kumbaya period, and the idea was that great, they will put the meanest guys on trial, and then the national jurisdictions are going to do the small fry and whomever, and then basically there will be not only peace but also just peace and truth, and some reconciliation will come about. Well, nothing of the kind happened. Uh, the head of the state was put on trial, plenty of generals, and well, even 2 or 3 heads of the state. I don't want to bore you. A lot of people were put on trial, and I mean, I'm very happy that they are not a part of Serbian political landscape. But the backlash was enormous. Firstly, extraditing them came at a huge political cost. Every extradition was conditioned. So every step of the Serbian way to EU was conditioned by extraditing X or extraditing Epsilon. And I was all for it, but I was trying to find those people. That was one of my tasks. I mean, if I would catch them, they'd be lucky to be extradited, actually. But the thing is, the price of constantly being humiliated and policed, and you have to, I don't know, extradite Milosevic, Mladic, this and that. Uh, People feel very slighted and constantly being schooled into something. In retrospect, it should have been done in Belgrade, and the resources should have been redirected to have some sort of a mixed tribunal and make people confront their own past where it happened, and not in the Netherlands. And then if it doesn't work, okay, it doesn't work. For instance, that's what people are trying to do in Kosovo, and indeed it doesn't really work so far. We'll see what's going to happen in the future. But the problem is that expectations from Serbia were enormous. Like a poor country which just went out of 4 wars was supposed to somehow face its past like Germany quickly overnight and punish itself and so on. And everybody forgot that it took Germans 30, 40 years to evolve to the level that they can do that. They had same people who were writing the Nuremberg laws were advising Adenauer, for Christ's sake. Uh, Plus, everybody forgot that Germany was just getting ever richer the more they were facing their own past. Completely, I mean, those were not connected processes, but it created a very weird situation in which somehow the entrenched idea is that the more you face your past, the better off you are financially and you become ever more powerful and so on. That's not the case. And I mean, the Serbs, even also Croats, the similar story. Kosovo, Bosnians were supposed to face their own past, having actually nothing and a very murky prospect for the future. And please don't misunderstand me. I'm not like here to school the West or whatever. I was an active part of that process, so I was very happy when somebody would condition something. I also thought that my country is nowhere ready to for a functioning democracy, and that these people are, metastasizing around, and they should be dealt with. Uh, but again, I understood that wanting something to happen doesn't really make it happen. Neither it's actually prudent. And yeah, sorry, it was again a long-winded answer. But about The Hague, I'm more than happy to talk about because, yeah, it was a good chance, I think. And again, that chance was buried the moment the US stepped out of ICC. So again, Rwandians and Yugoslavs and Sierra Leoneans and Liberians were supposed to be ad hoc attempts, but when it came to the big thing, the Americans blinked. And they were behind those tribunals. So just imagine the idea for the ordinary Bosnian or a Serb or a Kosovar thinks, aha, I see. So The Hague is for us and for the Africans, but not for you. So for you, I mean, I don't know, some other rules apply because you're nicer, and then Abu Ghraib happens. And then it's like, no, you're not nicer. You're just more powerful and beyond the reach of law. And then people get pissed.
Thank you very much. It's fascinating. And as far as I'm concerned, I'm taking notes on several things that you've touched in detail. And I also think that honest conversations, sometimes as painful as they are, are better than, doing all over the same thing, and expecting different results, because that will be the definition of madness, no? So Vladimir, I have a question, two actually, really brief ones, something that caught my attention. So, if you have to, so we know the Euro pessimism, as a genus, it has its, very sort of, similar, common denominators across different European countries. But what would you describe, for our audience, what is the defining feature or what typically Serbian feature of this Euro pessimism, specifically when you were showing us the graphs? So this is my first question. And the other one is, if you can elaborate a little bit about on the Banya incident with the paramilitaries, because I thought that this is something quite important but overlooked. Thank you.
It is, yes. And I'll start with the Banjska incident. It's overlooked because the timing was very wrong. So it was late September, And we all know how October looked like. So it's bad timing for starting the war, October. So I think that both sides decided to de-escalate in a sense, and by pure chance, in a sense, the bigger catastrophe was averted. We don't know factually what had happened. For those who do not know the details, simply overnight, several dozens, if not over 100 of Serbian, mostly Kosovo Serbs, but some from central Serbia, quite well armed. They mingled in the northern part of Kosovo, which is under the Kosovar control, but not completely. And also there are lots of international forces there. And then they were apprehended and there was shooting, exchange of fire. There were deaths on both sides, but in the end, the Serbian group was evacuated. Some were arrested and there is a trial ongoing. So we avoided a huge problem escalating into some sort of a mini war. Okay, so that's probably good, right? What's probably bad is that the head of that group is a well-known criminal from northern Kosovo, a Serbian dude who clearly runs his own show very strongly in Kosovo, and he ran into Serbia, and that's when the problem starts. So he's not prosecuted in Serbia, nor extradited to Kosovo, whereby one of these two things should have definitely happened. Of course, Kosovars immediately accuse Serbian authorities of being behind it, but there are no evidence to such thing, and that's very dangerous. So this is not something the Serbian government actually wanted to happen in that moment, for all sorts of reasons. Very delicate negotiations are happening between Serbia and Kosovo, and even smaller things are small points for the other side, let alone having dozens of bozos with Kalashnikovs roaming around. And the word on the street was that actually it's the wings of Russian intelligence service, which are powerful enough to mobilize Serbian
GRU, right?
paramilitary and Serbian intelligence service, which are then powerful enough to get in touch with semi-private factors like this Radonjic is. He is something that Arkan was in the 90s. And that does make a lot of sense. Vucic, I would be the last one to defend him, but he's in a very delicate position insofar as he is playing the Western tune in this broader political sense. But he is at the same time courting Russians, partially out of this equidistancing idea, partially because he's having such anti-NATO constituency, because all of his voters are extremely anti-NATO and anti-EU, and partially because he sees that enemies of Russia are being thrown out a window, enemies of Putin, better to say, and that Putin goes medieval on his former friends who, for whichever reason, let him go. And so he has to choose, it's a very, I'm not pitying him at all. He cooked his own soup in so many ways. The crucial problem is that he's not at all working on dispelling those clouds in Serbia, like working with these misperceptions, for instance, about who gives money to Serbia. And it's not possible. It's absolutely crazy that for 10 or 20 years, people think that China is the biggest economic player in the Balkans. That talks volumes also not only about the lack of readiness of Vucic to actually call spade a spade, but also of this enormous propaganda apparatus of EU promotion. How is it possible that with so much money which is flowing in, you can't really actually make it obvious? So that's something that I'm completely perplexed with. So Banjska really remains to be seen. Like Vucic couldn't really. Sometimes I think what happens sometimes is that even if you are a nationalist, democratic backslider, and so on, sometimes you become hostage to extreme wings within your own ranks. And he can't just ditch Kosovar Serbs, because if he ditches them, the same will happen to him as to Milosevic. You all remember that Milosevic was toppled through a coalition of those who hated him for starting the wars and those who hated him for losing the wars. And Vucic is facing similar prospects somehow. So this is why I say that he can be actually toppled. He's not, which is not such a good thing because he's feeling unsafe, and he didn't
Understood.
show
Yeah.
his worst face anywhere near. So he's not,
Yeah,
these things like
Vladimir, yeah.
hitting people left and right. It's Balkan folklore. It's not.
Thank you.
He has he has many drawers that he didn't open yet. Blackmailing, compromat,
Yes,
disappearing
yeah.
people. None of that is actually happening in Serbia.
Mhm.
And I don't doubt that, I don't exclude the possibility that those drawers get open at some point
Mm.
if he gets more. And I think that the West is already accustomed now of taming him, that's their vision, that somehow they will court him into becoming less brutal and more hypocritical, and therefore more more
I'm
acceptable to Western political culture.
Thank you very much
Uh,
for engaging with this, Vladimir, because as far as I'm concerned, and as I've written in the chat, if any of this, which is quite logical of what you're explaining, right? I mean, he is in no position or it's not he doesn't have immediate interest in any of this, specifically in light of the escalation, that you were describing on both sides of the border, and the behavior of the Northern Kosovar, what do you call this, assembly of municipalities and so on. So it makes no sense. But if that is true, then and word on the street gets confirmation, that this is actually a operation which was in supported, inflamed, encouraged, you name it, subversion. That means that again, a lot of people have to think twice, three times, when approaching, this whole sensitive problem, and I hate, thinking about it as a powder keg and so on, but quite obviously, it has the potential for what I call spillover effects, right? Because as you said, immediately goes up north, to Bosnia, and so on. I would argue even that you would have, ripple effects into Northern Macedonia. So it's not an isolated thing,
Of course. Plus, that would also mean that he is actually not in charge on the top of it
Mm.
all. So that if somebody can do something like that, and you can't do anything afterwards to, whatever, smoke out
Undo, yeah.
whichever wings, that means that you're cornered. So again, we don't know. I will ask my friends, what do we know? Are we smarter now than we were? But honestly, everybody was so afraid of that spillover that nobody really wanted to dig deep. It was like settle it somehow. Really, I can't think about it because
For
the
the
chaos
lid.
began in the Middle East.
Mhm.
But I forgot the first question. I apologize so much.
No,
Please.
that was really brief. Just, what makes Serbian Euro skepticism distinct from any other type of rhetoric that
Uh,
we've heard?
yes. So firstly, I think it's the bombing, which turned the Serbs against the West in totality. The Serbs tend to think of EU, if they think at all, more or less like some sort of an American puppet of some kind. I will give you a plastic example. I don't get to be proud of Serbia many times, but I was proud during the migrant crisis because Bulgarians started having Nikolai is here, so he can tell me why this happened. Hello, Nikolai. Haven't seen you in a long while. There were some even private persons hunting down the refugees left and right. Not too much, but it was happening. In Hungary, complete idea of defending Christianity and European values happened, and so on. And again, I think that the core Western Europe was a bit hypocritical in a sense of saying, okay, we will give asylum to all the refugees, and then at the same time making sure that not too many come. So us Balkan lunatics are going to stop them because we like kind of beating up Muslims, and that would trickle in a sense. Again, I'm sorry if I sound like some conspirator. I'm not saying that this was a shared idea, but I'm saying that the Hungarians were given a free rein to be ante morales Christianitum and so on. Uh, and then the Serbs were so offended with the idea that they are supposed to be American policemen or German policemen, and they were like, "What? You like?" Uh, the common logic was, "Look, we had problems with some Muslims, with Bosniaks. We don't have abstract problems with global Islam. That's your problem, not ours. So we are the last persons. You bombed us. We are the last persons who are going to now, fight against the Syrians and Afghans who are passing through the country, and just shipping them upwards to Croatia and to Hungary with gusto." And so this is the thing. And I will give you even more shocking example of this distorted reality. That's something that I'm deeply ashamed of. So now I said something that I'm proud of, but now I'll say something I'm ashamed of. September 11th, it's a horrible day. And in Serbia, people were rejoicing. And they were rejoicing in a way which was so drastic that Minister for Foreign Affairs, who was a very reform-minded guy, he asked the people not to rejoice openly because he understands them, he says, but it complicates Serbia's foreign political situation. Now, I can explain this only through some sort of temporary madness, in a sense, where you feel so much pent up anger that somebody was tormenting you for a while. You are not able to understand the reasons because Serbia never really completely understood or faced the depths of its criminal policies in the 90s. But even if it did, it's not that people would say, "Great, well now bomb us." And then there was this release of idea that unbeatable, the US is actually punished in such a way and so on by people who otherwise don't like Muslims. So the Serbs didn't have much reason to rejoice that the extreme Islamic group successfully destroyed World Trade Center. Um, but yeah, I think that explains. I don't know what it explains. I just know that I was mortified. One plastic reason why I'm mortified. My daughter was born on the 24th of March, 2015, and that was the beginning of the bombing. And every time in Belgrade, we have beautiful celebrations. Lots of friends there, cousins and whatnot. Everything is peachy. And then in the evening, I see long processions of the government. They put kids instead of kids who died in bombing, like a dozen of kids or so, with they come on stage in white clothes with candles and stuff like that. It's really macabre and so on. And then I'm bracing for a moment when I'm going to have to explain nitty-gritty to my daughter. Yeah, I don't know. Sometimes it's easy to say that we are all in the same boat, but it's easier
Thank
said
you.
than.
Thank you, Vladimir. I think that you've, pointed out several quite important kind of nascent features, which make Serbian Euro pessimism different, from necessarily, the ones that, exist. I'm pretty sure, it shares a lot of the, the sentiments and commonalities, with what is kind of like the generic, in the region and beyond, actually, just because we know that now. I think you mentioned something quite specifically that relying on cordon sanitaire policies might be, something of the past. And now, Western Europe and Central Europe,
Little Texan, little Texan Luca wants to say hi.
there you
We're talking
go.
Lucky Luke.
Hello.
Hello. So thank you for doing so. Mary?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, just a few words. I thank you so much for, I love thinking through all these questions. Obviously, you're extremely knowledgeable, so it's been really great to hear everything you've had to say. Kind of on that last point, though, it made me think about when I was writing my first book on Muslims in the Balkans, and it was the 90s when I was there doing research. And I had Bulgarians say to me, well, the West is supporting the Muslims and is trying to carve a green corridor through the Balkans. And so there was a, from Bosnia to Turkey. And I was like, what? No, we don't, like, we're not pro-Islam, so there was a weird way in which the West became the West, which again is this amorphous thing, and no, by no means monolithic in the minds of people in the Balkans, but became equated with Islam. And then, so and later it was quite different. But of course, there's a long history of people in the Balkans playing different Western powers off each other, playing Russia off other Western powers. And so there's by no means a kind of naive, just sort of, I guess you could say, Balkans being manipulated by the West, but rather, I think a really, kind of thought out, in some cases, nuanced and even savvy dealing with outside powers when it comes right down to it.
We are in the same boat in that regard, that we all, in a sense, manipulate one another. This theory that you mentioned, the green transversal, actually, is very popular, or was very popular in the Balkans. And now you gave me an idea. I'll give it to a student for a paper. Because the only thing you missed was that in the meanwhile, look at me, I have a great beard. I'm a research professor in Belgrade, and also I'm working in NIOD. I had been a graduate student or postgrad 10 years ago. So I'll give him an assignment to see if it might be that what had happened in the 80s in Yugoslavia, and perhaps even in Bulgaria, was a precursor to great replacement theory. Because the idea was back then for sure that Albanians are multiplying on a level that Serbs cannot at all match, and they couldn't. That was true. And there was the idea about replacement and so on. But again, it doesn't make me at all happy like that we were up to something and now it's a global trend. The whole question is how to be countered. How can these things be countered? I mean, I don't know. We can all make a mental exercise. So a lot of money was spent on bombing Serbia. perhaps it could have been used somehow in a more smart way. I don't know which way. I just know that Milosevic was not harmed by bombing at all, and some innocent people were killed. For the life of me, I don't understand how come that superpower that's the best that the superpower can do. I don't know. I just refuse to believe it. But I don't have a better solution. That's also the case. About the Hague, I have a cynical friend who says that so money was spent on the ICTY that you could have built a house for every refugee. And actually, I can show you the budget. That's true. And we don't really have anything near reconciliation or reckoning coming out of that. I don't know, perhaps these things take time, but we don't have time. I think that the time is slowly running out, not only for this session, but for many others.
Well, thank you for those wise words and good ideas. I think we all need to be a little more creative in our policy in the Balkans and everywhere, perhaps. But thank you again so much for coming
Thank you.
today, and we'll close our session with that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Splendid. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. And again, expect an email from me in July when I go. I heard Texas is beautiful in July, right?
Right, it's wonderful.
Scorched
Thank you.
earth policy.
We
Okay,
had
so great to see Volodymyr and Nikolai, and also to meet all the others whom I don't know.
Yeah,
It
it's
was a
Thank you.
great talk.
looks
Yes.
like a CU club.
uh,
Exactly.
well,
Greetings from Budapest.